Welcome, everyone. I've been told we have to get going here. Welcome, everyone, to UC Davis, for those people from the outside. This is the first meeting organized as part of a collaborative project in which I'm involved. I'm Jonathan Eisen. The other people involved in this project are Mackenzie Smith, who's over there, and Mario Biaggioli, who's over there. And we have a grant from UC Davis through this new program called the Interdisciplinary Frontiers in Humanities and the Arts that relates to, in essence, the topic of this meeting in part, the future of scholarly publishing. And as part of this grant, we are tasked with organizing a meeting every year. And this is our first annual meeting with a dire title of Publish or Perish, I guess. If you're on Twitter or want to be on Twitter, we have a hashtag for the meeting, PublishPerish14. We wanted to scare people a little bit. So anyway, thank you for coming here, and I'm really looking forward to this event. What we tried to do for this meeting basically was cover sort of two major topics. And day one is really what we and you and other people sort of view as the current state of scholarly publishing. Obviously, we're not going to cover the entire field, but we tried to cover a couple of different topics related to the current state of scholarly publishing. What are people doing with journal publishing right now? That's the first session. Various aspects of journal publishing. Then the second session is on sort of beyond journal publishing, other forms of publishing, whether it's data or code or three-dimensional objects or whatever that is. And then the third session today is on new developments in peer review. And then at the end of today, we're going to go to a separate venue for the keynote talk by Yochai Benkler. And then tomorrow, the focus of the meeting is on basically how we assess scholars, the different aspects of assessing scholars in this new landscape of scholarly publishing. And that would include discussion of metrics that can or should not be used for assessing scholars in different fields, and then how institutions make use of the information on new scholarly publishing. So that's basically the scope of the meeting. Is really day one, the current and sort of developments happening in scholarly publishing, and day two, there's also a session on the economics sort of related to economics of publishing on day two. So that's sort of day one, current status and how things are published. Day two is the assessment and implications of publishing practices. Before we start, I just want to thank the UC Davis IFA program for funding this, as well as the Mellon Foundation, which has funded some aspects of bringing Yochai Benkler here and supported the development of this project. And I also want to thank in particular Allison Fish, where did she go? In the back there, who is our sort of project manager for this ISIS project, as we call it. And she has been the essential person in helping plan this entire meeting and coordinating everything and communicating with people and probably harassing some of you, but maybe not too many, and getting everything to work. And she's been absolutely amazing, so thank you, Allison. She told me before the meeting that I should thank her after the meeting's over to make sure things go well. A couple of other sort of technical details. There is, for people who are not from UC Davis, there is wireless in here. There's a little sheet out in the back by the table if you need instructions for logging on to wireless if you're from outside UC Davis. This is a LEED Platinum new facility at UC Davis, so please, when you eat something and go to throw it away, almost every plate, fork, utensil, and other things can go in the compost bin. We try not to throw anything in the trash unless it can't go into the compost bin. And there's also recycling bins all around. There's a coffee break at 10:30 and then a lunch break where you can go either on campus or walk into town to have lunch, and we can provide more detail about that after the first session. So the way the sessions are going to work is for each session we have an opening speaker who has been allocated a small amount of extra time relative to the other speakers, and then a series of additional speakers who are going to give short sort of introductory talks to prep everybody for the panel discussion that's going to happen after the series of short introductory talks. And we have a series of questions that we've thought about, but of course we welcome questions from the audience as part of the panel discussions too. And if anybody's tweeting, we can even invite questions from Twitter here. And I think that is all the bureaucratic information. Is there any other? There are bathrooms out in the back. There's water fountains if you want just plain water. I don't think there was plain water on the table in the back. If you missed it, there is food and drinks by the registration desk. Anything else? Any questions about procedures or what's going on here? All right. The hashtag #PublishPerish14, all one phrase. And I asked on Twitter yesterday for advice for what we should use as the hashtag, and that was the consensus of 2.5 people. So we'll take it. All right, so for this session, we have 4 speakers. Heather Joseph from Spark, John English from Cold Spring Harbor, Chris Kelty from UCLA, and Greg Gordon from the SSRN network. First up is Heather Joseph, who is the executive director of Spark, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Center. Is that correct? Coalition, sorry.
That's why we say Spark.
Yeah, Spark. Heather Joseph from Spark, telling us about scholarly publishing status. And she has no slides.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to come and talk with you today. The older I get, the worse my eyesight gets, so I apologize for the reading glasses on the bridge of my nose. I'm not used to them yet, so I'm feeling kind of like grandmotherly, going like, oh, children, I'm going to talk to you about scholarly publishing today. Hopefully it won't change my style all that much, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. So I've been given the task of opening the conference and trying to provide a bit of an overview. The small charge in terms of topic that I was given to cover is the current status and landscape of the scholarly journal system. I was going to start in the 1600s and then realized I've got about 12, 13 minutes, so I don't think that that's going to fly. So what I'm going to try to do is when I started thinking about how to focus this talk and what would make sense to try to present, to try to stimulate conversation and discussion among my fellow panelists and you as the audience, I was thinking about not only the title of the symposium, but the title of the project that Jonathan and Mackenzie and their colleagues are running, the Innovating Communication and Scholarship Project. I wish I had known that you termed it ISIS, because as you were sitting there, I was thinking, I'm just of the generation that thinks of ISIS as a cartoon character, and I want a superhero logo for your project, but I'll draw that one for you later. Thinking about the broad topic of innovating communication and scholarship, and kind of juxtaposing the fact that this session is about the current landscape of journal publishing, it really struck me that for the last decades, for my lifetime and past that, the journal publishing system has been more or less synonymous with the scholarly communication system. The primary way that scholars and researchers have communicated and shared the results of their work has been through the publication of articles in journals, right? That's really been at the heart, the key, the nut, the crux of how scholars communicate their work. And we've talked now for the better part of 2 decades about the transformative potential that the internet has and the vast new opportunities that network digital technology attendant to the internet has to present researchers and scholars with new ways to communicate their research, right? To think beyond the traditional system. And while we've seen some change, I tend to be a glass half empty kind of girl on the best days, but we haven't seen this transformation take place at the breakneck speed that many of us hoped or thought would occur with the introduction of the internet. And it also hasn't happened in the places that I think when you look at the journal publishing system that would seem most obvious, most ripe for change. I can remember working as a journal publisher for the first time in the early 1990s for the American Astronomical Society. And my boss at the time, the executive director of the society, Peter Boyce, looking at me and saying, so you're coming aboard this beast called scholarly publishing at an amazing time, right? There's this thing that's coming along called, at the time it was DARPANET, and we were using BitNet and UUNet addresses for our scientists in the astronomy community. And he was all jazzed and exercised in 1990 about the fact that here was this amazing tool, and our members were going to look at us and pose this conundrum to us. They're going to say, we're collecting our astronomical data digitally, we're sharing those digital results and working on them collaboratively digitally. And then when we come to you guys as our scholarly society to promote the communication of results, you're telling us to reduce this digital information to paper abstracts for meetings and to paper articles for journals. And they're going to demand that we change this tomorrow. So in 1990, there was this sense of an imperative, at least from one scholarly society that was a journal publisher, that I thought, okay, I was just hired last week, we're going to do this by the end of the year. In 2014, we're still talking about making the translation, the full translation, Peter's full vision of really fully being a part of the workflow of scientists in the scholarly journal marketplace in the way that we have the ability to do with the internet. Just as, not as an aside, but as something that I think is really important to understand, it's not a total surprise, right, when you look at the journal publishing system that this hasn't happened at breakneck speed. One of the marked characteristics of the journal marketplace is that it is a marketplace, right? The STM journal publishing market is almost $10 billion, billion with a B, $10 billion a year revenue producing industry. It's a marketplace where journals have become commodities, and commodities operate very differently than just sort of pure intellectual property. The players, the biggest players, are simply not incentivized from a financial standpoint to make big changes, to take the big risks that they see attendant with moving into new ways of operating the journal publishing system. I think it's interesting to think about the idea that for scientists, right, taking risks is part of the game. For journal publishers, taking risks comes, along with taking risks comes the possibility of losing a piece of your profit margin. Losing a piece of your profit margin, you're not rewarded with, okay, go ahead and try that again and see what you can learn and build on that little experiment that you made. It comes with you lose your job. So the conservatism in the marketplace, I think, is largely to be expected, and it is something that has caused us to move very, very slowly and cautiously as a whole, as a system. But I think these things are beginning to change. What's been interesting is watching the somewhat piecemeal process that the transformation that was possible has been taking the form of. What we've been seeing is not a wholesale shift into new ways of transforming the journal publishing system, but rather little tiny and sometimes larger than tiny initiatives that have been chipping away at key points, pressure points in the system. And that in recent years has really begun to accelerate. Even me, as the glass half empty girl, recognizes the fact that the pace of change is beginning to really snowball and accelerate in measurable ways. All of the traditional components of the way we communicate in the journal system are under pressure to change. And perhaps more interestingly, the connected nature of the steps in the scholarly journal publishing process are also under pressure to change. These steps are being challenged, right? They're being challenged in a significant way. When we first started talking about changing the nature of the journal publishing system, it was very much an intellectual exercise where we were sort of posing, well, these are things that need to change. But right now, what's new and what's different, and what we're really feeling and seeing in the marketplace for the first time, is the fact that these pressure points in the system are being materially challenged. Materially challenged by the introduction of new services, new products, and new initiatives that for the first time introduce options into the system. Options for authors and for other participants in the system now exist for virtually every component in the traditional system, from where you submit your paper, to how you submit your paper, to who you submit your paper to, what certification looks like, how articles are disseminated, and even increasingly, as we'll hear a lot about in this conference, how your work is evaluated and valued. So we're on the verge of a scholarly communication system where real choice is being introduced for the first time. That sounds like such a little thing, but when you think about decades upon decades, this is the only route to getting your work shared with your colleagues and getting your work out there into the community. That not having options, going from that sort of single choice world to a world where we now can actually envision and are being presented with options for each component of how we might want to share our scholarship. We really see that we have some significant opportunities for us to do things differently. The makeup of this first panel, I think, is really going to underscore a handful of the pressure points where we have these new opportunities. And the critical pressure points in the journal system are many, but there's a handful that I think might be of particular interest and particular note to consider as we proceed with this conversation over the next 2 days. First and foremost, the journal publishing system is under pressure from the people it was designed to serve to better optimize that system to do what we need to do to communicate scholarship, right? And that's a big pressure when it's not pressure from outside or, oh, we need to keep up with the Joneses. When the people who are actually using this system in order to do their work are saying, it's no longer working for me, that's the biggest driver of change and of pressure that a system can be under. And we're seeing that happen in spades. I think that the part of the pressure has been articulated as, look, we need a system that's optimized to allow us to share our work and to build on the work with others first, the work of others first and foremost. And I think that's the reason that the most visible manifestation of the transformation that we've seen to date has been open access, right? And that journals and that scholars have begun to adopt open access practices for journal publications. This gets at the heart of what it means to optimize the system for participants. The drivers behind open access that were articulated by one of the founding groups, the BOAI, the Budapest Open Access Initiatives, in 2001, I think encapsulated this nicely, right? They noted that the reason they were getting together to talk about a new way to work in the journal publishing environment was that there were barriers in place, barriers to doing work that needed to be taken down. And they articulated these barriers as financial barriers, right? It's expensive to get access to these journals. Technical barriers, right? DRM is really slowing us down and causing us trouble. And legal barriers. Even if we can get to the work of others, we can't always use it in the digital environment in the way that we want to use it. And those barriers, I think, are hugely important. Right? And at the core, the idea of open access being introduced into the system as a way to facilitate change gets to the heart of how we would go about, what we would envision as a system that's optimized, right? The free, immediate availability of articles on the open web, coupled with the rights to work with these articles fully in the digital environment. That's talking about really getting to the heart of optimizing what is it that I, as a scholar, as a scientist, as a researcher, want to do, need to do on a day-to-day basis in order to do my work the best way possible. So while I'm really happy to see the growth of open access journal publishing and true open access journal publishing, and I do see signs, we definitely, when we track the numbers, are seeing signs of its upward trajectory, and all signs are that this upward trajectory will continue. 11 years into talking about and working on the concept of open access, we still see less than 20% of all articles in the scholarly world being published under true open access conditions. That is, being made immediately available, carrying a license that allows users to do anything that they want to do with their content. There's slow start, it's a slow start for sure. You know, there's an inertia in any marketplace, and there's been significant pushback. In the early years, we had a lot of the sort of comments of, this will never work, right? This is just too large scale change to consider happening from publishers, whether they're society publishers or commercial publishers. And I confess I'm naive enough that coming out of the AAS with Peter Boyce as my boss, I thought people would jump on it. I thought that this is the road forward. Of course, especially scholarly societies, we're going to leap onto this bandwagon and say, these are the barriers that are in place. Our members are asking for this. We're going to do this. Obviously, this doesn't happen, or it isn't happening quickly. Sign of the times that it is beginning to happen even in some of the more recalcitrant organizations was the announcement from the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, yesterday, that they are getting into the open access journal publishing game in 2015 with the launch of a new open access outlet. Sign of the times as well, the AAAS is not converting science to an open access model, right? So we see this one step forward, little baby hesitant steps. There is still a real fear associated with facilitating and implementing large-scale change in the journal marketplace. So open access only answers part of the questions and identifies some of the barriers that are in place that provide challenges for us to transform the journal publishing system into a mechanism that really allows full communication and conduct of scientific research. Some of the other barriers that remain, a second key pressure, I think that people take for granted, but we're starting to see, and I know my co-panelists will address this in detail, key pressure on the system is having to deal with the barriers presented by time, right? And time in many senses of the word. The pressure of having enough time to review the number of articles that you're asked to review as a scientist. I don't know a single working researcher, scholar, scientist that doesn't turn around and go, I have to turn down reviewing articles because there simply aren't enough hours in a day to deal with the growing number of articles. And I think it's interesting, sometimes people present this as, well, there's a growth in papers, but I really see the pressure on the system not being the growth in papers, but the dearth of time, right? We can't mess with the clock. We'd like to be able to provide more hours in a day to allow researchers to be able to actively interact with the papers that they're being asked to interact with, but that's simply not in our ken to be able to do, at least to my knowledge yet. Maybe you're working on it at Davis, I don't know. If so, please talk to me first. And the other working moms in the audience, we were having this conversation on the way over about the space-time continuum. Really not. That's also a system that's not optimized yet. We need to work on that. But this pressure of time is sort of multifaceted, right? That not having enough time to deal with the number of papers that you need to deal with in the review process and the editorial process, but then also the flip side of the time that it takes to get your ideas to market in the scholarly journal publishing world, right? This is a significant pressure that open access can't deal with, or alone can't deal with. This idea that you submit a paper and then you wait for some indeterminate period of time for that idea that you've constructed, that you're ready to share with the world, to be considered by the process that we have now of peer review, considered ready to share with the world. Whether you feel it's ready or not, the process that we have now introduces a somewhat, I think very strongly, artificial barrier of delay of time into the process. And that's an enormous pressure on the system. And while peer review is often held up, much like democracy, as imperfect but the best system that we have, the growing inefficiencies that individual scholars, right, the participants in the scholarly communication systems are feeling are pretty staggering, and they're becoming much harder to simply push to the side and say, well, that's we can't do any better than we've been doing. One of the key developments here, and that we'll hear more about, and I hope we'll talk a lot more about over the next 2 days, is the emergence of alternatives to begin to effectively address this question. And whereas in the past, what I see to be optimistic about is that we seem to, as a community in the past, have been content to look at this problem and think small, right? To think about, as publishers, shaving a day or a week or a month off of our turnaround times. Now we're actually looking at solutions that are coming to market that begin to deal with the problem very boldly, very aggressively, and saying, we want to eliminate the delays altogether. What is the point of the delay in waiting to get ideas to market? And providing solutions that can help us do this in a comprehensive and high quality kind of way. We see paid peer review services like Rubric, Peerage of Science emerging that are beginning to toy with the idea of decoupling the peer review process from journals altogether. And viable post-publication peer review is beginning to emerge. I look at Faculty of 1,000 Research as one of the outlets that's actually experimenting with making this a potentially viable option, a choice to say the work can get out there immediately. And as we'll hear more about from two of our panelists here in this first panel today, the idea of preprints and what it means to host a preprint server is being completely reimagined and presented to the community in new ways. A third key pressure point on the current system is the pressure to improve how we evaluate and value the results of scholarship and scholarly research, right? Pressure on how value and impact, how we measure the value and impact of works is increasing in intensity. One of the key reasons that transformative changes move so slowly in the scholarly journal system is that scholars hadn't been incentivized to make changes, to do things differently, right? We're a very traditional system rooted in traditional values and traditional processes. I mean, I think that's a theme that we've seen play out over and over again, that we want to respect the traditions, but we also don't want to let the traditions stop us from being able to put one foot in front of the other and move forward. And I think we've seen this in relying on imperfect measures, relying on artifacts from paper-based worlds, proxies that we should have only sort of grudgingly made do with until alternatives presented themselves. And for the first time, we are actually seeing, much like in the peer review and the peer review and certification portion of the scholarly journal construct, we're seeing alternatives to the traditional measures beginning to become viable and beginning to proliferate. Right? The emergence of article level metrics that let us think beyond this single measure, the single proxy of an aggregated statistic or metric coming into the forefront, and having creative people led by PLOS with developing article level metrics first, but certainly with the proliferation of other independent, nonprofit, commercial groups picking up these ideas of article level metrics and developing, again, services, tools, initiatives, products that are ready for market and ready to be used for the first time, really presents the opportunity for a game changer in the journal publishing world. And the final pressure that I think is reaching a critical point in the journal publishing market is the pressure to finally treat digital articles differently than paper articles. I mean, it sounds ridiculously simple, but it's been a ridiculously difficult thing for our community to get our minds around. That under the right conditions, right, that the opportunity has been there in the digital environment to think about articles, to present them, to interact with them as more than just a sum of their parts. And fueled in part by the rising popularity, I think, of mobile devices. We all think about, we're trying to figure out ways to chunk information down to the way that it's easiest for us to look on our handheld, right? That's a driver, and it's been a driver in many other industries. It's sort of finally hitting us here in the scholarly journal world. And that's great, right? I don't care where the pressure comes from to facilitate this change, but there's a sense of urgency that's been missing in the journal publishing marketplace for the last 15 years that's finally coming to the front. We've really got to be able to deliver information to people where they live. It's no longer just in labs. That hasn't been the case for many years, but we're finally, I think, that pressure is catching up to us and really forcing our hands in terms of developing positive changes. We'll hear more about this from another one of my fellow panelists in this session. I think the main theme that I want to leave you with is that there's the notion of disaggregation might be the most central and salient pressure of all, right? What we're talking about is this traditional system of scholarly publishing, right, that had components from registration. You submit your article, you get that date stamp that you have submitted your article, and put it into the process so that the wheels of scientific publishing can begin to turn. It becomes certified through the peer review and editing process. It's communicated, disseminated through some measure, first paper journals, now increasingly in the online world, and then that paper is archived into perpetuity and is available for people to read and to work with. What we're now seeing is we have some add-ons on the front and the back end in terms of options for where and what you might be submitting to add to the scientific record, all the way through to we have new options for how those outputs might be evaluated and counted towards and valued in the totality of the scientific record. All of those components have been tightly coupled, they've been interdependent, and they've essentially all been carried about by single entities up until this point. The notion of disaggregation of these different emerging services in all these different areas that I just described are being provided potentially by different players, by independent players, by collaborations among publishers, with one publisher providing one portion of the service, another providing another piece, players that we hadn't considered partnering with, coming up with new services from evaluation to peer review services, paid peer review services. This notion of disaggregating the value chain of scholarly journal publishing is finally at the point where that gradual pressure that we've seen chipping away at each component in the system it's eroding enough where we can actually imagine it's going to break apart and we're going to be able to put it back together in a way that makes more sense and in a way that optimizes the journal publishing system for the community. That's my hope. That's my glass half full way of ending this talk. And what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to have a conversation and hear from incredibly innovative participants and other panelists throughout the course of the next 2 days. That'll show us the way forward to picking up the pieces and putting them together in a way that makes better sense for science. Thanks very much.
We're going to wait for questions until we get to the panel discussion. So we're going to now have a series of short talks from 3 speakers. First up is John Inglis from everybody's an executive director, I think. Executive director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, and doing all sorts of things related to scholarly publishing, but one that's very new is the creation of something called bioRxiv. Full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board. I haven't done much, but I'm on the advisory board. So anyway, John. Are you doing?
I am doing slides. Someone should have told me that you should never follow Heather Joseph to the podium. That was a great talk and very inspiring in many ways. I regrettably have to rely on the prop of slides. Oh, thanks. Which seem to be not here. Oh, no, here we are. Here we are. Okay, so is this okay? Can everybody hear me? I'm told that I have to stay behind the podium, which is not my normal way of doing things. My name is John Inglis. I am the executive dictator of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, and have been for a rather extraordinary period of time, during which a lot of the kinds of changes that Heather's mentioned have been discussed, and now, as she says, may actually be about to come to pass. If I were not here, then I would be here. Cold Spring Harbor is on Long Island, close to New York City and several other academic institutions. And I'm showing you this to remind me that back home, there are people digging out after another 6 inches on top of the 2 feet of snow that we've had this winter. So as you can imagine, I am deeply popular at home. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is a multifaceted place. It is a research institution with very active and prestigious programs in these scientific disciplines. But for as long as it has existed, and it goes back to the 1890s, it's also been a place for not just doing science, but sharing science. And that has happened in a whole variety of ways over the years. Our communication activities now span a very active series of conferences, both on the main campus, at a little think tank nearby, and also in a conference center in China. Our teaching activities span a graduate school as well as residential professional level courses in a variety of topics, and also, of course, publishing. The publishing program now consists of 180 books and manuals, a number of them electronic, a group of research journals that have been well received, and a group of newer review journals which are making their way in the world even as we speak. The mission, basically, why does the lab have a publishing house? Well, its mission really is to help science, to help scientists succeed, to help science advance, to reflect the highest standards that the lab expects in all its activities. And publishing at Cold Spring Harbor must support itself, and any surplus is donated to the support of the other activities of the lab. And this statement at the bottom here is a part of the sort of publicity statement that surrounds the laboratory's activities. So it's part of our job to continually ask ourselves, what more can we do? How better can we do what it is our job to do? And of course, one of the things that we've been very interested in for a long time is the existence in physics of the archive. I met Paul Ginsberg, the founder of arXiv, sometime in the late 90s, when the server was still quite new. He was still at Los Alamos Labs. His concept was simply to use the newly developed electronic technologies to substitute for the common practice of physicists in sending paper preprints to each other. And this had turned out to be a great success. It started in high-energy physics and expanded outwards. And I remember that conversation well, because we talked about why a preprint server would not work in biology. And I had some well-developed reasons for why that would happen, why that would not happen in biology. But that was the late 1990s, and we were aware over the last few years that things were changing, and in particular that the supposedly physics archive was attracting a lot more submissions from the world of biology. Broadly speaking, quantitative biology, but nevertheless demonstrably biology, and the submission rate of biological papers to the archive was going up. And this chart makes that point more strongly. I think that many people in biological science were really very unaware of arXiv, but one of the things that made people more aware of its function was the notorious case of the arsenic life paper in Science, where Rosie Redfield and her colleagues posted on the arXiv their refutation of that Science paper, submitting it in, I think it was January, and then again submitting it posting it on the arXiv in January, submitting it at the same time to Science. It lived on the arXiv for 7 months before Science finally published the refutation in the magazine. So that was a reminder that the arXiv had a very valuable function in terms of distributing information. There is the notorious paper. So we began, roughly speaking, I think at the beginning of last year, to have a series of conversations with scientists at Cold Spring Harbor, with others, about whether the time had come for a preprint server for biology to be a useful contribution. Was this something that we could do? Was this something that we should do? And it was a fairly extended process. During the course of it, these are the kinds of comments that came to light, very reflective of some of the things that Heather has just said. Impatience and frustration with many points in the chain of scholarly communication. And with that in mind, I was able to write a proposal to the laboratory, and much to my surprise, quite frankly, I was given the opportunity to start this project. And I say surprised because the scientific leadership of the lab represents a certain conservative approach to how science can and should be done, the highest standards. But fortunately, the president of Cold Spring Harbor saw the value of what we might accomplish if we began this service. So we got the opportunity to start. So the characteristics of the server are quite simply that it's a service that the laboratory provides, that it's intended to make versions of scientific papers publicly available before they are finalized and submitted to a journal, And we made an early decision that these should be just versions of papers, not PhD theses, not abstracts, not posters, but versions of papers. We are covering all of biology in broad strokes. We knew that submission would have to be free. We knew that posting would have to be immediate, but with a screening process which I'll describe, but certainly no peer review, and it would have to be free to access. We also felt it was important that it be independent of our journal program and anybody else's, and we also realized that we would have to make a long-term commitment to this project in terms of preserving the content in perpetuity, and the clocks system is the one that we elected to choose. We were fortunate to get the attention and the interest of a distinguished group of advisors, among whom Dr. Eisen is prominent. Not the busiest, but the most well, one of the prominent. But to be fair, we haven't really asked these individuals to do anything for us. We regard them as very valuable sounding boards for questions and concerns that we have. So any foolishness that goes on with bioRxiv is our fault alone. So the advisory group falls neatly, as you can see, into a group of prominent scientists and also some distinguished people from the world of information. This is what the homepage looks like. It is deliberately intended to be simple and approachable. Manuscripts are submitted through a conventional manuscript submission system called BenchPress, which is managed by Highwire Press, which hosts the service. Once a paper is submitted, then it goes through two very rapid processes of scrutiny. The first one is purely an administrative one in-house to make sure that this is indeed science. This is not, in other words, spam or something clearly inappropriate. And then the paper is seen by a group we call affiliates, who are about 50 or 60 younger scientists who look at a manuscript and just reassure us that it is indeed science, without making any judgment as to the quality of that science. But once they have done that, they can release the manuscript to go live on the server. And generally speaking, that process takes often merely a matter of hours from submission to public availability. And the line at the bottom about versioning simply reinforces the fact that authors can go back and resubmit updated versions of their manuscripts at any time. This is what the list of articles on the server looks like. They are categorized, as you can see, by subject area, which is a choice that the author makes when the manuscript is submitted. This is what a paper looks like in the context of bioRxiv. There are certain functions that you can see up on the top right there, where we managed to track the tweets associated with the manuscript, the likes on Facebook, Google+, and so on. And this is what the history looks like under this tab, where here you can see the version that you are seeing is the third version, and the listing is of the previous submissions. So the features of the posted manuscripts are that they have a DOI, which makes them citable. As I said, the author chooses which subject category to put them in. Revisions are posted anytime. They are date stamped. And we also ask the author to describe their manuscript in one of these three categories: new, confirmatory, or contradictory. There are usage metrics on the site. We have alt metrics coming soon on the site. There is the opportunity for commenting, and we also offer authors the choice of licensing, and those flow from highly restricted to not restricted at all. We are also working to insert links between a final published version of a manuscript in a journal and the final preprint version on bioRxiv. And as a consumer of the content of bioRxiv, you can get email alerts and an RSS feed of anything that you like. So what are the benefits of actually doing this? Well, obviously, the first one is that there is rapid transmission of your results to the broadest possible audience. The manuscript is discoverable and it's citable, and the community at large, therefore, can get the opportunity to look at your work before publication and comment either on the site, and a certain amount of comment has gone on. That ancestral DNA paper that I showed you had, I think, 9 or 10 comments associated with it. But more often, authors tell us they hear privately from colleagues. The further benefits are the opportunity for feedback that will, one hopes, improve the eventual version of the manuscript that gets submitted. And this is a particular benefit for early career stage scientists who perhaps have not built up a track record of publication that is sufficient to give them visibility, but their work can be seen on the archive. And that would allow for grant applications and hiring decisions to be made in greater awareness of the work that has been done. And obviously, if the work is looked at in this context and found credible, then it assists the forward momentum of other work. So we launched bioRxiv on the 11th of November, so it's almost exactly 3 months ago. So far, we have 190 manuscripts plus 50 plus revisions. A predominance of, in terms of subject matter, they are predominantly in genetics, genomics, bioinformatics, but of those scientific disciplines listed, all but 3 have something in them. So far, just over half the manuscripts have come from the United States, and a large majority of them present new findings rather than contradictory or confirmatory findings. And in terms of the license choices that authors make, as you can see, they are tending towards the restricted rather than the more open. There has been a great deal of attention paid to the server. It's getting lots of traffic. Papers that are posted get quite a lot of Twitter attention. The amount of commenting, as I said, has been modest, but there has been some. And private feedback is a more frequent phenomenon. And even though we've only been going for 3 months, already some of these manuscripts are showing up in journals. And these are just some of the journals that we've been able to track bioRxiv deposited manuscripts in. And another very interesting consequence of this launch, I think, has been the conversations that we've been able to have now with a number of journal publishers about their own attitude, their own policy towards preprints. Not all journals are very fond of having preprints or allowing preprints to be submitted as manuscripts, but a number of large publishers, large society publishers in particular, are in the process of reviewing their policies in that respect. So this is early days. We have a great deal to do. One of the things we need to do is increase awareness of bioRxiv, because we have actually only publicized it through word of mouth and Twitter. And we have much more to do in that respect. In doing so, we are going to make the point that preprints benefit science for the reasons that I've described. We know we have culture change to invoke. People express concern about being scooped and also about being unable to submit their manuscript to a journal of their choice. So that makes us want to advocate for change in policies with those journals, which we are doing. We'd also like to see a greater diversity in the subject matter, because many of the people in genomics and bioinformatics come from a world in which they're very familiar with arXiv and its practices, and we'd like to make it more generally aware, make scientists in biology more generally aware than they currently are. The next stage, once we've established things a bit more strongly, is to go out for funding. Archive is funded very significantly by philanthropy, and we feel there will be an opportunity for us to have the same support. But for the moment, the laboratory is very happy to see the progress we're making and will be funding it for the foreseeable future. And finally, we will be listening to the community, which is how we got started in the first place. So we're looking all the time for feedback from users, from readers, from philosophers of these things for how we might do this better. Preprint policies are being tracked by the community, and there's a Wikipedia page that lists those policies. Being listed in green is good. Being listed in red is not. Here is a quote from one of our other advisory board members, Leonard Krikliak, who paints a future where journals get submissions based on their preprint policies. And when you tell that to journal publishers, then they tend to look a little tight-lipped. So let me finish just by saying that we owe a great deal to a number of people. Bruce Stillman, the president of the lab, has given this project his personal endorsement, which we're very grateful for. Richard, Linda, Ted, and Wayne are my principal colleagues at the press who are moving bioRxiv forward. Highwire have been tremendously helpful in this process. They described us as being at the bleeding edge of their technology the other day, and I'm not sure that was a compliment. We have the advisory board who, when we ask them things, are always helpful. And this group of affiliates are really a very important part of our process in reassuring us that what goes on the server is something that will be of value to the community. And of course, most of all, we're very grateful for those pioneers who have taken their chances with this new project and give us their manuscript. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Next up is Chris Kelty from UCLA, who many people may be familiar with because he was heavily involved in the development of the new UC open access policy that has been recently introduced. I don't know if you were the executive director of the committee. You are now. But actually, that's not why we wanted him here. He also runs a journal called, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this, LIMN. All right, which is a really interesting sort of new forward-looking, well, not totally new, but forward-looking journal in terms of integrating new digital information into it. So thank you, Chris.
Sure. I just have to hijack this here. Let's see if I can plug this in. Please excuse me while I play with dongles. I've been joking that this is the kind of conference where I know everyone, but not for any of the reasons I got into academia. But this is a great opportunity actually for me to talk about something which is closer to my research and which is, I think for this, conference, an experiment thinking about the small scale. These are journals, if anyone wants to come up and touch them with their hands. So I'm going to talk to you then about this project called LIM, which is a small journal that I run with a couple of colleagues. And I'll talk to you about the various aspects of it and why I think it might be interesting to think about as an example for changing practices in scholarly publishing. Now, LIM is, I am in the associated fields of anthropology, science and technology studies, sociology, the interpretive human sciences, basically. And this is a project that I run with some colleagues, Andy Lakoff and Stephen Collier, to try and rethink the kind of publishing we do in that domain and to think about how to create new venues for the research that we do. And it's a pretty small scale world compared to the kinds of things you'll hear about from other folks on this panel and throughout the conference. And so what we do is publish conceptual, historical, and ethnographic analysis of contemporary problems. And we've done 4 issues so far. So we did one on systemic risk. We did one on what we called clouds and crowds, new information technology. We did one on sentinel devices, the use of organisms to predict catastrophe, and we did one just recently on food infrastructures, which hasn't come out yet, but is in the process of being designed. And each of these issues contains about 15 or 20 articles. They're very short. They're 750 to 1,500 words. They exist both online and in a print version, and they're curated, not peer-reviewed. So what we have are a bunch of different kinds of problems that address complex technological, economic, or ecological issues that we think interpretive social scientists can add new insights to. And so we, for instance, study supply chain security from an interpretive human scientist perspective, or the environmental aspects of the Large Hadron Collider, or labor union perspective on crowdsourcing, for instance, or the production of E. coli in factory farming, right? And these are all examples of the kind of the articles that we published. Or just recently a great article about the menhaden, which is a fish that all of you have eaten and none of you know what it is, because it's overfished in order to produce nutrients for use in all kinds of other things, ranging across the spectrum of different kinds of foods. And so we're interested in these kinds of problems and the kinds of insights we can add to them. And we're not a peer-reviewed journal. We're quite proud of that. And we're not peer-reviewed, and that means a particular thing, which is that we actually are much more interested in curating the research that we produce. And so by curating, we have several layers. We have a set of editors who are the people that run the journal, myself, Andy, and Stephen. And then for each issue, there are a set of editors who are involved in discussing a topic of timely relevance, the kinds of ecological, economic, or technological problems that we think face society, and coming up with a kind of conceptual core for the issue, and talking through who would be the right kinds of contributors for that. So what we do is try to activate the network of people who already know each other and are already doing research together in order to solicit contributors. And then those contributors go through a process of intensive editing with the editors of each issue. And so there is actually something that looks a lot like traditional peer review, but it's not done with the intention of making it blind and distributed and slow. And part of this is also because what we hope we're doing with each issue is not so much just publishing people's research, but juxtaposing it in a way that allows for this curation to bring new insights across things. And so here's just a screenshot of our web-based version of the journal, where we try to lay everything out in this form of juxtaposition in order to visually promote the idea that thinking about lots of different kinds of problems together can lead to new kinds of conceptual connections. And so each journal then will have an interesting variety of articles in it, ranging from things that address the very contemporary and very sort of media-saturated problems to historical articles. So something on Anonymous, for instance, next to a history of focus groups and how they construct crowds or collectives, for instance. Or in the food infrastructure one, a study by an anthropologist of global public health in Guatemala, next to a historical article about the introduction of cans and the creation of the consumer, right? And so thinking about how this form of juxtaposition, almost kind of like the academic equivalent of a Tumblr feed, although that makes it sound really kind of silly, but that allows us to work on the conceptual connections amongst research and not just the production of individual siloed articles. And so the kinds of insights we're interested in, then we take a form that emphasizes rapidity, and by rapidity we mean something which for the scientists in the crowd might sound awfully slow, which is that it takes us about 6 months from beginning to end to do an issue. And that's extraordinarily fast in our fields, right? I've been involved in edited volumes that take 4 to 6 years, right? I've been involved in journal publishing that can take over a year to do. At this scale, things happen slower. And so the fact that we can do this in 6 months is actually quite impressive, I would say. And we're interested in producing a wider discussion around these issues as well. Not exactly the popular press, as it were, but a kind of wider academic discussion, something that might reach into domains of academia that would be surprising to us, right? So we want dialogue with other kinds of academics, scientists, engineers, and also folks who we think of as being what we call first-order actors, people who are involved directly in the kinds of contemporary problems that we're interested in. So when we do something on food infrastructures, we're interested in talking to food activists and to food engineers and getting them to contribute something. When we talk about supply chain security, we're interested in security experts who are not academics and getting their feedback on this, or even contributions as well. And so we're interested in trying to do this rapidly and to contribute to a discussion, but also to do something which I think is very familiar for scientists, but not so much for humanists, which is to simply display ongoing research, right? So a journal article for a scientist is one snapshot of an ongoing experimental project, right? It's something that says, here's what I did this week, right? And then there might be another article that says, and then we built on that and did this. A lot of the work that goes on in the humanities and social sciences doesn't see the light of day until it's done, right? Until it is either in a 6,000 to 12,000 word article, which is the final article, or a book that really sort of displays all that. So there's a niche here for us to display what is going on in the humanities and social sciences in a more digestible, communicative form. And that's part of why we do this. And so Frederick Keck, one of our editors, for instance, has done this amazing work on Hong Kong and the H5N1 virus and how it's treated there, and he's going to have a book on it. And so this is a kind of preview of the book. Debates about the collection of plastic in these floating islands of junk in the Atlantic, for instance, from our friend Baptiste, which will also be a book, right? So kind of preview, as it were, of this kind of research. We're also, as you can see from the images, and the reason I'm showing you the images is because we're devoted to the idea that design actually plays an important part in communicating these research ideas as well. And so we're devoted to thinking about design and illustration as part of the debate and discussion around these conceptual connections, right? And we involve our designer, who happens to also be an anthropologist, in these discussions, and we think about bringing in other kinds of artists, information designers, et cetera, to think about the problems that the academics are also thinking about. And so each of the issues then will have some kind of graphical representation that tries to cut across all of the articles that are in an issue and represent that in some fashion. So from the first one here, a kind of timeline of systemic risk, a set of different characterizations of crowds and collectivities in the crowds and clouds one, descriptions of different kinds of heralds and warnings for the sentinel risk one, et cetera. So these discussions around that really are sort of heavily animated by our interest in design and illustration, and also to some extent the facility with which digital tools can allow this to happen. Now, this also creates for us possibilities for taking advantage, and I think this is what Heather was talking about here, taking advantage of what is an increasingly wide array of really easy to use, often free tools to do this. I want to emphasize that I am not the executive director of LIM, actually, because there is no infrastructure here, right? I am not a publisher. I don't really want to become a publisher, though that's one of the directions I get pushed in here. We do this is a labor of love. We do this with free tools on the side and no help, right? And we use money that we get from research grants, right? So research grants cover any given issue. And we publish issues as needed, as we say, right? We don't do a periodical or we're not on a timeline to do this as rapidly as possible. But some of the tools that enable this for us then are probably familiar to most of you. We create space to do this. Our site is just a WordPress site. We're experimenting with Gumroad as a kind of commerce system. We use MailChimp to spam people. We use Google Analytics, obviously. These tools are all, and especially for the small scale, again, a kind of niche thing, we can occupy this niche without paying for any of this, because most of these systems operate on the idea that at the small scale, this should be a free service. If we were to grow, perhaps we would have new kinds of costs, but at the small scale, we don't have to worry about it. So our costs then are primarily what we pay to people. And we try to get awesome people involved, and we try to get people who have time to work on this, and we try to pay them to do what they do. And I know this sounds odd in the day and age of all the new wonderful things that technology can do for us, but we really are devoted to this, and we do this despite the fact that we insist on giving it away for free. So here's one of the people who takes most of our money. This is our designer. Here he is spending our money. I think he's got a beer in his right hand, actually, I'm sure. But no, this is Martin Hoyam, and he's an anthropologist, and he does the design. And we pay him, a good chunk of what we do because he spends a lot of time thinking about how to design both the print and web stuff that we do. And he's the kind of person who can spend the time paying attention to what's going on in that world and can tell us how to do things and what to do and what not to do. And so we're very committed to paying him. The online version is open access, obviously. We wouldn't have done this without the possibility of doing that. And so we put these articles up there freely to circulate. They're under a very liberal CC license. We have a very sort of thin layer of legal expectations from the authors. We just basically make them say, yes, you can have a non-exclusive license to put this up there. And then we do that. And it works quite well. And we've gotten quite a fair amount of attention just for doing this completely on the side. Now, it turns out, actually, that in talking to people, scholarly publishers really like LIM, and that's great. I get a lot of good feedback from people, and they say things that are very flattering, like, this is wonderful, and this is really innovative, and you're doing great things. And then they say, how can we make it more like what we do? And by that, they mean a couple of things. How can we standardize the format, right? How can we make every article seem like every other article? Because there are economies of scale in doing so. You're designing each article separately, and that's expensive, and you shouldn't be doing that. Can we make it peer-reviewed? Right? They want it to be peer-reviewed because it's a big risk to publish something that isn't peer-reviewed in the scholarly publishing world. Let's reduce the number of images in color. I was told by Wiley what it would cost to publish this in color, and it was something that worked out to between $50,000 and $70,000 per issue, which is about 2 orders of magnitude more than I spend on it. Possibly actually an infinite number of orders of magnitude, because CreateSpace, just all I have to do is upload a color PDF, and they deal with printing it. So, I don't understand the economics there, obviously, but they say that. Make it more disciplinary focus, ironically, in the age of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity and whatnot, in order to fit into the categories and structures that are already in place in the scholarly publishing industry. Make it closed access, obviously. None of them want to take the risk of doing this until open access is a proven business model. Design it once as a template. This goes back to standardizing it, right? So instead of designing each issue or each article, instead, design it once and then churn through the articles as they come in. And pay us money to do it for you, which is a great idea, except I don't want any of the things on the list above that, so it's not really worth it for me to do that. So we say thanks, but no thanks. It turns out, actually, foundations love LIM too, and as you can imagine, they say this is wonderful, and lots of other flattering things, and then they say, how can we make it more like what we do? And this is a little bit more encouraging in that they mean things like make it an app. And we love to make it an app, but we would need to have some money to pay someone to make it an app, and then we would need money to pay someone to keep it functioning as an app, and on down the road. Scale it up to transform the entire scholarly publishing industry, universal discipline. So this goes against my point that thinking about the small scale is actually important here as well as the large scale, but I respect the idea, the fact that foundations really want to transform things. Make it less disciplinarily focused, right? So the opposite of what the scholarly publishers are telling us, actually press it in the direction of transdisciplinarity, right? So that's good, but we're trying to do that to some extent, but make it more like digital humanities. This is what we've been hearing a lot of recently, and this message comes through loud and clear. But so does the message that we should make it less like digital humanities because it's too much of a fad. And so we're a little confused about whether or not we are digital humanities or not. Make it less like a journal without sacrificing all the work that goes into making it great. So, I think there's this anxiety that what we're doing is creating a traditional journal, and that doesn't look like transforming the publishing industry. And that could be a problem for us. So to that, we have to say thanks. More, sir, please? Because they're foundations. So we're not saying no thanks. We're just saying that we would still love some money to do this. Okay, so this is, as I say, an issue of scale, and it's a question of thinking about the small scale. And we actually have a couple of different options, a couple of roads we can go down as a small scale publisher, small scale entity. One of those is to stay small, right? To just keep on doing this as a labor of love. Insofar as I can find the time to do this on weekends and at nights, then I can keep doing this until I burn out, basically, right? All the tools are there. I can find enough money to pay my designer. We can get it done, right? So we could do that. But there's actually something else going on which I think is potentially more interesting, which is that we could connect
with a whole lot of other people who are occupying this same set of small niches. And there's actually an increasingly large number of journals, kind of like LIM, that are doing kind of the same thing, but who are trying to maintain the flexibility and the ownership over what they do, because they care about experimenting with scholarship and they care about experimenting at the level of the publication. And so finding a way to actually create a consortium amongst such publications would be one thing that I think hasn't really been discussed in the scholarly publishing industry and in the foundation world, that could actually really benefit at a larger scale a lot of these small scale entities. So what does it look like then to create such a kind of a consortium, something that would do this? A lot of us have need for, well, for high qualified people who can devote their lives to doing this kind of work. And it's really about paying people to do a good job at any of these sort of flexible publishing industry, publishing practices, right? So paying designers well, paying copy editors, paying, you know, this is bread and butter stuff. But there's an opportunity for doing this in a different way that isn't siloed into different publishers, for instance, but creates a consortium that sells these services and sells them because we think they're valuable and would actually pay for them if they were available in a form that didn't ask us to fundamentally change what we were doing. So that's all I'll say about this. As I say, there are some hard copies here for you to take a look at if you would like, or even purchase if you would like. And the credit goes to my colleagues, Stephen Collier and Andy Lakoff, who helped me do this, the various issue editors for the different issues, our designer, our copy editor, and the funding that we have seen to date. So I appreciate you listening to me about this. Enjoy the conference.
All right, and our last speaker before, are you running this off that computer? Our last speaker before the discussion is Greg Gordon from the SSRN, the Social Sciences Research Network. And you've heard from John Inglis about the new, shiny new bioRxiv. Well, SSRN has been around since 1994, I think, basically doing related activities in social sciences. And you will hear a little bit about that now.
While I get set up, thank you, Jonathan and Mackenzie and Mario, for the chance to be here and talk about SSRN. And hopefully, normally I'm pretty good at this. Okay, so you now see my children swimming with a big fish off the Great Barrier Reef. Okay. So yeah, we've kind of been doing this for a little bit of time now, and a lot of the themes have been talked about, but let me try to give them to you from a social science and humanities perspective, specifically what we think about and how we look at things from SSRN's perspective. And so if you start off at maybe a 20,000-foot level, it's kind of facilitating this discourse, right? We want to make sure that it's science, we want to link things together, but we really want to start to facilitate the conversation. So then people say, what do you do? What I say is we actually provide tomorrow's research today. And that's our tagline. So what we focus on is getting this stuff that's written in and out very, very quickly. We'll talk more about the how in a minute, but what I want to try to frame the further panel discussion is around the how. You know, not just the why are we doing this, but the how are we doing this, and how can maybe this start to transcend across different disciplines and really start to change the world. Because we think that that sharing of research, that shortening of the research life cycle is really, really important. So as I start to talk, think about the possibility that all research was done 20% faster. If we could just make the clicks faster while not losing some of the other things, I think we open ourselves up for some really innovative research being created faster to benefit all of us. Now, for those of you that don't know SSRN, I'll give you a couple of quick overviews of it. The most important thing here is the last bullet point. We don't take a copyright to anything. We strongly support open access by allowing authors to submit for free, and any author-contributed content is downloadable for free. So we believe that it's important to have things come in and come out for free. Now, we obviously have to survive, and we've done that for several years, as Jonathan said. And we do that by wrapping services around that. So way before Chris Anderson and Eric Brynjolfsson came up with the idea of a freemium model, we basically were a freemium model. So we provide alert services and we provide back office services to hundreds of organizations around the world. And by doing that, we basically allow us to continue to exist. We have a chart here with authors. The blips, these are new monthly authors added to the SSRN library. The blips are, to the beginning, are the National Bureau of Economics Research, the IMF and World Bank, and then a large association where we brought in a lot of conference proceedings. So these are new authors contributing to it. So right now we have about 250,000 authors who have content in the SSRN library. The SSRN library is our online database. Everything we do is electronic. Everything we have ever done has been electronic. So the concept of born digital doesn't really matter to us. It's just all digital. Now, as I started to say a moment ago, the author is our customer. Now, we don't charge the author anything, but the author is our customer. We realize that a researcher's baby is their research. In some cases, more important than their actual babies. And we respect that, because that's how they operate. But we treat these babies with kid gloves. So when you call SSRN, somebody answers the phone. And I know that's kind of a silly little thing. But if one of your children is sick, you want to talk to somebody. You don't want to go through a voicemail system. You want to talk to somebody. So when their babies are sick, we pick up the phone and help them get well. For that, they've rewarded us. We have about 500,000 papers. We get 70,000 new submissions every year across about 24, maybe 26, depending on how you slice and dice some disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. And what's slide here is, what you see is that the blue dots are, maybe not. The blue dots are daily submissions, and the red dots are revisions. So in the fall of 2007, we had this crazy concept of actually opening up the e-library to revisions. Now, we've always focused on working papers. We have always had a lot of accepted paper or peer-reviewed or other types of final content. But we said, let's try opening up and see what happens. And as you can see, immediately, people started to revise the content that was in the SSRN system. So it became this living, breathing corpus. Now, the chart ends at April of 2012 for very important reasons. At that point in time, almost 2 years ago, we actually had daily revisions exceeding daily submissions. And for those of us who deal with repositories, who deal with archiving, who deal with preservation, all those things, that's kind of a freaky kind of thing to start to comprehend. This is a flow of content, and it starts to open up a whole nother set of problems and things that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But this is a living, breathing corpus of content. So you get it in, and you can actually follow it through and massage it and grow it and get feedback and collaborate and be invited to present this information and actually evolve it over time. So last year, as I said, we had about 70,000 submissions, and we had 38,000 revisions. Again, a lot of content coming in. We have authors from around the world. We are still predominantly US. The US is downsized by about 65% in this particular world. But you start to see a lot of people from a lot of places around the world sharing their content because they can. Now, we believe in letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and we think that one of those things about letting 1,000 flowers bloom is that they really need to come from a lot of different places. When you submit something to SSRN, you can classify it in up to 12 different e-journal categories. So as I said, we have about 24, 26, depending on how you count them, disciplines in the social sciences and humanities that we currently cover. We have about 3,000 classifications within them. So we get very, very granular in a number of areas so that people can find something specifically that they call home, either as an author or as a reader. And then they can pick a dozen of them. So if I'm an accountant and I write on Sarbanes-Oxley, I can put it into financial accounting, I can put it into managerial accounting, but I can also put it into regulatory law or securities law or some anthropological issues that talks about the ways in which people in professional settings interact based on regulatory issues. And we think this cross-pollination of ideas is critically important. We all talk about interdisciplinary, but when we talk about interdisciplinary, we really talk about this idea being shared appropriately with a lot of people in a very specific area. So the lawyer gets the accountant's perspective of Sarbanes-Oxley. The accountant gets the lawyer's perspective. And we believe this cross-pollination of ideas is important for starting to create new innovative research. It's not just about finding what's in my container, in my little cloistered department. It's about seeing what's happening in the rest of the world. We have a lot of users from around the world. Now, we've been predominantly US, and this is from 2011. You'll see a slight change when we get to 2013. But more importantly, what you see here is the growth of some countries that haven't traditionally used a lot of scholarly research from our experiences. So Japan pops up. Relatively small population, but they're starting to use this content more frequently as they start to move towards open access and more sharing. And India jumped up about 4 spots because it's available to them. What we just announced, I was just in Tel Aviv a week or so ago, and in Tel Aviv we announced with Bar-Ilan a Hebrew research network. So we basically took SSRN and we allow now research written in Hebrew. And we think that's nice and wonderful, but what we think is important is this cross-pollination of ideas from another perspective, geographic perspective, not disciplinary perspective. So the Indian scholar who's writing about the slums in Mumbai can now share that research, and yes, the inputs are going to be different and the outputs are going to be different, but this core algorithm, this core concept of the research can be shared with people who are writing about favelas in Rio de Janeiro or ghettos or slums anywhere else in the world. And it's this cross-pollination of ideas from a geographic perspective. We have a lot of downloads. We have a run rate of about 1 million a month. It's not time to talk about gaming, or some other people talk about metrics and all that kind of stuff, but I'm happy to have that conversation over a couple of cocktails later. But we're pretty confident that those numbers are good, and they're roughly about half of what we actually received. So last year we had about 12 million downloads that we felt were comfortable enough to count. We actually had about 21.5 million downloads in total. So we're weeding out the clicks and everything else and the occasional, geez, I don't know how I managed to download my paper 5 times in a row stuff. We created some technology called SiteReader, which basically started to look at the citations across papers within the SSRN library, because we didn't find another tool that allowed us to do that. And then we started to work with Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West on adding eigenfactor into the SSRN library. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with eigenfactor, what it basically does is do this really complicated, way beyond my mathematical skill capability, mathematical bouncing around within a set of network nodes that allows you to tell what influences what. And not just does this reference this in the traditional metric system, but actually how do these things start to affect the different nodes across a broader network. And we think that it starts to provide some really cool things. But again, it starts to say things a little bit differently than citations or downloads. Now, we don't have time, but what Carl and Jevin start to look at is how do we then take the relationships and create, as they would call it, this mapping of the scholarly communication city, but basically say, here's all of the papers that have to do with Sarbanes-Oxley, or here's all of the papers that have to do with transportation or social work, regardless of the traditional disciplines. So when we get these things into repositories, when we make these things available, we start to have the ability to do cool things like this that weren't possible before when it was in a very narrow silo. Now, I get to this point, and I always come back to my second favorite quote of all time from Max Planck: "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. And a new generation grows up that is familiar with that." Now, within the SSRN land, we have about 24 active Nobel Prize winners. And if you know any Nobel Prize winners, they tend to be generally older people. We also have a significant number of people who are newly minted PhDs. And newly minted PhDs tend to be generally younger people. So we constantly find ourselves, I will break that by the end, we constantly find ourselves in this like mishmash of how do we maintain the integrity and the reputation and the importance of traditional scholarly approaches to things while being pushed about, you know, why don't you have a Tumblr feed for all the cool stuff in social work? So this give and take we think is important because it helps us continue to go forward, but I must tell you, in the confidence and quietness of this room, it can be very, very frustrating. I wrote a paper against the grain, actually a few years ago now. And what I talked about was the value of these metrics and how downloads start to show you some currency of information, how they become important, and how citations tend to be still a very, very good traditional measure, and how eigenfactors, I said a moment ago, start to pollinate these different things of impact across the network. But the reason I threw that up there was because the paper, and it's just a couple pages, but what it also talks about is disciplinary differences, which I think we'll probably talk about in the panel discussion. And in the paper, what I basically say in very, very summary fashion is that I look at STM like a rifle shot. I'm trying to find the cause of this or the cure for that. And the social sciences and humanities I liken to more like a shotgun approach. What do I see? What am I observing by this pattern? So as we start to talk about maybe why preprint servers work or don't work or haven't worked traditionally in different disciplines, that's kind of the talking that I come from. As I start to think of things as being more specific, and we can get into the need to keep your research cloistered in grants and funding and all those other kind of things, but I see things as kind of having a general difference between STM and SSNH in that way, that it's this solution versus this observation. So I come back to the question of how. And I'm reminded by a book from 2007 that I actually kind of picked up last year, Culture of Improvement by Robert Friedel, and I think I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. But quickly, what he talks about is, and one of his examples are clocks in the 14th century. And he talks about how you needed to kind of take this mechanical capability of suspending weight and allowing it to then go through a specific set of intervals to give you something we call time now. But that was just basically a measure of intervals. It allowed people to then talk about them. And what he says is that this achievement was less about the clock itself, but more about the beliefs in our ability to solve problems. And that how this standard of time, of how clocks created community. Now, we're not talking about the great man theory, but what I think we're talking about from my perspective is really more of a culture of sharing. I have an idea and I move it forward. And so this commercialization, this marketing, this sharing of the simple idea allows us to move things forward. And he says that happened in the West versus other areas, and that's kind of the premise of the book, is that this is why the West moved forward versus other areas. But I think that the incentives are important. I think that the ability to create, to innovate are very, very important. But I think that the ability to have these things available are critically important. If I don't have these things, I can't do these things. So I'd argue that there's a similar sharing happening in scholarly research. And that the people who have spoken today and the people who will be speaking for the rest of the day and tomorrow are talking about this sharing, are talking about these really cool ways of moving beyond publishing or perishing. Now, my final two thoughts are the following. Many of you have seen this, plus, I've seen it probably in 100 presentations myself, and this is Johan Boland's and others' clickstream analysis. So they basically looked at 2 billion clicks of researchers and what they then did as they started to move their way through the scholarly research process. And when I looked at it, I saw this. I saw law, and what I saw above was that law was connected to sociology and economics and Asian studies, but it also starts to connect down into some really interesting areas like philosophy and demographics and religion. And what I read in that is that people are looking for this new idea outside of their discipline. They're looking for, what can I get to? How can something be shared with me that helps me create something new and innovative? We work closely with Erik Brynjolfsson and Heek Young at MIT, and Heek Young wrote a research paper, and she says SSRN is great, so I try to show that every presentation I can. But most importantly, what she talks about is that that basically putting your research into SSRN, controlling for everything else, is going to get you 10 to 20% more citations. And I would never, ever, ever doubt anybody's research that basically says that SSRN is great. But I think she's missing an important point, and that important point is that it's about the sharing, it's about the access, it's about the ability for the research to be made available simply and easily, at least as much as it's good old SSRN. Thank you.
want to have at least some semblance of a panel discussion here? I'm going to crack the whip on the 5-minute short talks in the future, but I've shirked my responsibilities for this first session. So I don't know, we asked Heather if she could serve as the Queen Bee moderator. Yeah? You don't remember? Executive moderator, you don't remember this? Of the discussion. I don't know if people want to start off with a pressing question from the audience, or if you have any things you want to start off discussion. Yeah, the surprise look on your face.
Let's turn to the audience and see if
Sorry about that,
you
Heather.
guys want to lead. No, that's fine.
Do people have?
We're good.
Yeah, we have a roving mic somewhere, but maybe not. If you just get up and ask.
So this is John Ingalls.
Can you say who you are and where you're from?
Can you say who you are?
Say who you are and where you're
Tim
from.
Vines. I'm from Axios Review, which is an independent review organization. Molecular Biology and Evolution have a new preprint policy. And their preprint policy is that the paper has to be made open access because it is already open access on a preprint server. And I was just wondering whether you thought that was a reasonable policy or draconian or crazy.
You may hear me say something to this effect a few times in response to questions like that. We're very conscious that with this project and other preprint activities, we're inducing culture change, and it strikes me as being inappropriate for me to pronounce on the wisdom of a particular journal's policies or not. I mean, when I mentioned the community drivers behind this development, I was serious about that, and part of that community are scholarly societies, are editors-in-chief, journals that have a very important role in the communication of science. So I don't think that we are in the business of pushing the journals around. I think our job is to find a way of doing what I said in the beginning, making something that works best for science. And I think journals are thinking about all of the kinds of changes that Heather referred to, and really thinking hard about how they should respond with all of the anxieties that Heather referred to. And I mean, we have journals of our own, and we have anxieties about them too. So I'm fully sympathetic to that view. So I think that in general terms, we're not telling journals what we think they should do. We are entering into a conversation about what we're doing and why, and seeing where that conversation leads.
I have a question for Greg. I'm Mario Piagioli, one of the 3 co-conspirators behind the conference. I liked the evidence that you showed about the increasing number of revisions. So do you think that that's because people eventually get their preprints published in the journal and they want to update what is on SSRN to reflect peer review, take out some errors, or they keep revising and uploading on SSRN because they don't get it published in a journal, and therefore SSRN is going to become the publisher of record, and so they want to. So do you have any idea about what's behind the revisions there?
Yes. It's okay. Yeah. Traditionally, what we saw, Larry Solom, law professor and blogger, wrote the 3 papers of SSRN, where he said, I put my 8 to 10 page idea paper up there, and then I put my 15 to 20 page conference or workshop paper up there, and then I put the final one that I put into a law review. And what we've seen is that there are some authors who revise like crazy, and a lot put up 1 or 2. But traditionally, that's been the case. What we're seeing now is actually a lot of post-publication revisions. And that comes from 2 basic areas. One is, I now have the ability in a very simple and easy way to share with the world what I've learned after I publish something. right? In many cases, as wonderful as any preprint server is, it's not until it's published that people actually sometimes say, oh, you missed this or you missed that. So that's that feedback mechanism that's there. But what we're also seeing is a bit of a backlash against some journals, specifically law reviews. They tend to want to publish an article that's a certain length. And anybody who knows a law scholar tends to know that law scholars want to write things that are very, very long to show that they really, really understand what's going on. And so you have this conflict between the two. So now what we're starting to see is where a journal has a constraint for size, they will put up the longer version and literally reference to the SSRN longer version within the published version. For a further discussion of this argument, for this and this and this, go to this one. So we're starting to see two of these post-publication paths occurring.
Another question in the back?
I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. My name is Peter Pay, calling from the University of Toronto. I heard a lot about, instead of information, ideas, and instead of scholarship per se, or disciplinary scholarship, it's sharing. So I just want to put out the idea that you might want to change the acronym a little bit to ISIS, the goddess of motherhood and magic, and where it's the innovation of scholarship, of idea sharing. So where you're trying to act as the midwives for earlier this year I was at the Research Data Alliance. So they're focusing on data per se. I think this group is focusing on the sharing aspect of the data. And I think the problem in the past has been an overemphasis on the information per se, and I think we need to look at those two extremes rather than the data per se, getting it authenticated, and the sharing process. Just a comment.
Do any of the panelists want to comment on data and sharing? The rest. Okay, go for itself. Other questions from the audience? Yes. Right, the lady right next to you.
Hi, I'm Lane Farley from the California Digital Library, and this question came to mind when Heather was speaking about the disaggregation of the system, and I thought that systems theme kind of flowed through the other talks as well. And so my question is whether, we've seen that happen in other worlds and other systems, and can we learn anything from that, or is scholarly communication its own unique thing and we're just going to have to go with the flow?
I'll say something briefly about that, which is that we pay very close attention to what's going on in the mainstream publishing industry and how journalists in particular and other people who are paid to write are dealing with this kind of disaggregation. And so we're really interested in the emergence of long-form journalism, new forms of short books, different modes of journalists interacting with each other. And I think there's actually a lot to learn from that. But there is a significant difference, which is a political economic one, which is that in that world, the economics work because authors expect to be paid for what they produce. And it's driving a lot of the innovations that are going on in the publishing world. In the academic world, the money flows in a different way. I'm paid a salary, my authors are paid a salary, and so we write these things for free and don't expect to be compensated for them. So we actually run into this problem where sometimes we solicit articles from people who are not academics, and their immediate question is, how much are you going to pay me for that? And so there's a really interesting kind of, diagnosis to be made here of whether or not the scholarly publishing industry and the mainstream publishing industry are actually in the same business. And if they are, how are we going to, find the hinge between these two things and deal with these differences?
Yeah, I would very much echo what Chris says. And of course, in academia, there's the added problem that the manifestation of your worth as a scholar is what you write. And your output is then judged by one's peers. And consequences occur. And I think that that's one of the major reasons why academics have been willing to do so much in the various components of the scholarly publishing communication process for no direct compensation at all, because they see their contribution as one that assists the scholarly enterprise. But I think there's a growing sense of impatience with that, that status, and that's one of the things that's driving the disaggregation of the supply chain that Heather referred to.
Lane, one quick comment. Every other year, it seems to be, I kind of get caught up by somebody saying, well, have you looked at systems research? Have you looked at the way that biological systems have evolved and try to apply that? And so then usually happens around Thanksgiving to New Year's, and I say, well, let me go pull out those papers and look at it again. And I usually about the middle of December think that I'm onto something, and then I start to actually try to apply it to different disciplines. And by Christmas Eve, I'm knee-deep in a bottle of wine because I realize that there's absolutely nothing that I can make sense of as far as the different disciplines, any sort of commonality across them from an SSRN perspective.
Other questions? We have lots of them. Let's go over here.
Thanks. Joshua Rosenblum. I'm at the University of Kansas and presently at the National Science Foundation. This is directed primarily to Chris. I'm curious about how you see your role in LIM fitting into the academic incentive system that the people who get paid to produce stuff for free operate in, and how your authors perceive that, and is that an issue for what you're doing? And then since I have the mic, I'm going to throw out one other question to the group as a whole, which has to do with the proliferation of institutional repositories for open access at many, many universities, and how they relate to all the kinds of initiatives that you've all been talking about.
So just briefly on the first question, we do think a lot about how our authors are evaluated. And in part, we're very devoted to finding young scholars who are working on these issues because, as I mentioned in the talk, for a lot of these people, there is no mode for them to get recognition for their research or to get their research out there until they've finished a long article and gotten it through the peer review process, or a book, which is an even longer process. And so to have their name out and circulating and to have their research out and circulating is, you know, it is a triumph of its own, right? It's just not something that we've been able to do in the social sciences and humanities. And that's especially important if you're talking about people working on contemporary complex problems where the debate is largely driven by the mass media and certain journalists, some of whom are better at it than others. And so we actually end up connecting a lot of our authors to folks in journalism or in other domains who are working on similar problems. We also are very devoted to making sure that these are recognizable as scholarly articles, so they can fit into a CV, they can fit into, you know, we don't want to experiment to the point where nobody recognizes what this is. And so we do have a limit on our experimental presentation of these things. They have to be citable. They have to look out like a journal article. We do care about that.
So I'd like to touch on the institutional repositories question as coming from the organization that wrote the white paper making the case for institutional repositories. We like to think that they play a crucial role in the ecosystem of scholarly communication. I think the reality is that we're looking at a piece of infrastructure, again, that needs to be optimized, that the connections are loose at best among the repositories, but there's, I think, potentially big roles that they can continue to play in terms of not even a supporting role. I mean, I tend to think of infrastructure as support in the background, but as a lever, as a touch point for really creating more meaningful change in terms of the academy in particular being able to reclaim control over the outputs of research coming from our campuses. I think that's the place that repositories can play a role, and maybe not in the sense that we tend to think about as simply having the content resident on our campus being the be-all and end-all, but rather having the campus be conscious that we have the mechanism to regain control of our outputs, and what does retaining that control look like? Not just physical residency, but also reclamation of the rights to use these articles, reclamation of the university and the university community's ability to license them in ways that make sense to optimize. I'll use the S word again, the sharing of the materials that could be in those repositories. So I think they're an underutilized resource, but I think there are efforts underway to have sort of a large-scale initiative to connect them and to optimize them in this way. So I'm also conscious that we're moving into the coffee break. I know many other people had your hands up, but our panelists are not going anywhere. So perhaps we can turn the rest of the panel discussion into discussion over coffee in the hallway. And you guys are all going to be here for the remainder of the next 2 days?
I'm here today.
Okay.
I'm not here tomorrow.
So you have to grab Greg today, so he will be mobbed at the coffee break. But thank you very much for your time and your attention.